Hello and welcome to the Big 5D podcast. I'm Charles Laughlin, editor-in-chief of BigFive Digital. I'm joined by Ashmita Singh. Ash, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Charles. Lovely to be here.
Lovely to have you. So you are the founder of SwapVend Afrika, which we'll get into in a little bit. But what we want to start with is a little bit about you and your background, where you come from. And mostly what we're going to talk about today is sort of inclusivity in the informal sector, which we'll explain what that means. But start with who you are, where you come from, kind of what led you into this path to sort of start all these impact businesses that you've started or been involved with. But kind of walk us through that briefly.
Great. Thanks so much, Charles. My name is Ashmita Singh. And I think maybe it's important to just frame what an informal sector is quickly so you understand when I say I come from one.
We can start there. That's fine.
Yeah. So I think by definition, an informal sector is just the opposite of a formal sector. So a not governed part of the economy, but
Right.
generally defined very much within South Africa and emerging markets, let's say, as a township. And I actually come from a township itself called Phoenix in the city of Durban. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. And
I am.
That's good. It's a bit of the warmer part of the country. And I was born and raised in this township, and I've been raised within this context, and I understand everything so intimately. Spent 21 years of my life before I had the opportunity to actually move to the hustle and the bustle of the big Johannesburg city, where my brothers created these pathways, these access points for us to actually leave the township and start creating our own individualized pathways.
And you're from a family of how many?
I'm from a family of 6, and I'm the youngest of 4 siblings.
And all brothers.
All brothers, yeah. And I don't know if you know much about brown families, but I can tell you it's pretty hectic being the youngest and being female in that family. But
it has its own set of dynamics, I'm sure. Yeah,
yeah, it definitely does. And I must be honest, it does lend to some of the knowledge that I have about some of the actual constraints we're going to talk about, because some of these things are so deeply entrenched in the way people actually function culturally, traditionally, due to these sort of like dynamics. And I mean, I'll quickly take you through, and I think it's quite important just to explain to you my work career. And
Sure.
I went off, got myself a degree in accounting. I got my honors, but I always had a deep passion to try and fix things and solve things, and definitely always wanted to go back home.
So accounting was a path to something. It wasn't what you wanted to do necessarily.
Accounting was what my dad told me I had to do. Came from a very financially constrained background, and he said, you can follow your dreams once you financially
As long as your dream is accounting.
Yeah, as long as you dream accounting. I come from a very, very highly academic family. Everyone's like really like studied a lot and done a lot, but I've always been peeking and trying to figure out. I like to think out the box. I like to figure things out, and I like to make other people's problems my problems. I've always been very people-centered when it came to
those are things people always say about accountants. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Anyway, did what my dad asked me to do, became financially secure, went into corporate, spent years. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the South African breweries, but
I may have consumed a few of them, but
yeah. So I was the one responsible for getting that into your hand. But
okay.
Ultimately,
thank you.
Yeah. So I headed up the region, one of the largest regions in the country, as financial manager. I was there for about 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
But my passion was always just ticking on how do I go back into really creating development in solving social problems. And in parallel to that, I started my own brand called Party for Change, where I connected the entertainment sector to the social sector to try and find a new way to actually channel funds to solve problems.
Quick question.
Sorry.
As you sort of progressed through this, you started a few different enterprises. Were they all not-profits, or were they for-profit but impact-driven, or how did you think about that? Did you have a particular bent towards one or the other?
So in the early days, everything that I started was a nonprofit. The social enterprise concept wasn't very big at the time. And I think as soon as that social enterprise concept came in, I started to develop social enterprises. But even my nonprofits always had like a sustainability model that tried to be at the bottom of it. Really don't like creating reliant models. So always try to be as emancipated from systems as is possible and to stand on my own 2 feet. Mm-hmm. So And I mean, to fast track that, I left corporate and I went and pursued that vision of trying to, get into the social development space. I joined a presidentially sanctioned vehicle called Youth Employment Services. At the time, Cyril Ramaphosa, our president, actually wanted the formal sector to solve social sector problems, so like the corporate sector. So he got a group of CEOs to solve for unemployment. And I
And did
served
they?
as chief. They are currently still working on it. So the aim was 1 million jobs in 1 year.
Okay. How'd they do?
Yeah, that didn't happen. I'm not going to throw the stats out here, but I can tell you that they're still trying to get to that number.
Okay.
I left there, but what I did get from there, Charles, was just a very, very intimate view of how people were trying to solve for the problem of unemployment, and was definitely one of the things that fueled trying something new, I would say.
So what did you take from, I mean, because that is kind of central to what our topic here. What did you take from that experience that told you, okay, here are some things that I can apply that will perhaps be more effective or more impactful?
As much as that initiative was so great because they were really trying to be very deliberate with solving that problem, they were trying to put more jobs into an already saturated economy, and I couldn't understand that. And it definitely made me realize that we really need to focus on the small business. Again, it's not. Everybody knows that small businesses are going to create the new jobs and stimulate the economy. And I just didn't understand how we could put any more pressure on the existing economy to solve this problem.
So this is a nice pivot into what we really wanted to talk about, which is SMEs, informal SMEs in this case. Was that always your opinion that small business was going to be the source of job growth, or did you come to that opinion through this experience?
I think I kind of knew that, but this definitely corroborated that for me, and just like seeing that this is not going to work if we don't go down that road.
Okay. All right. So take us to the next step. What happened after Yes or Youth Employment Services?
I left there and I left with needing some rest. As you can see, I had a very long trajectory of work there. So I took a small little gap year and decided to start my own business. That's when I established a business named BigFive Afrika.
Okay.
And I spent a lot of time I spent a lot of time with small businesses. I was meant to actually build strategies for larger businesses, but I made no money that year, Charles. I just went out and I said, let's work with small businesses. It's one of the most rewarding things.
Where were you
to actually
doing
do
this?
that on the ground.
Was this in Johannesburg? Was this in
Johannesburg?
Okay.
In Johannesburg, yeah.
And these were all township businesses, or were they all over the place?
There were a range of informal businesses from township sector all the way into in urban spaces, and just finding anybody who had a really great idea and try to incubate those ideas for them and actually help them go to market.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can we kind of get into some nuts and bolts about the informal sector, whether informal SMB or SME sector? I'm an American.
Yeah.
We say SMB all the time, small and medium businesses, instead of small and medium enterprises, but it's the same thing,
Yeah. Okay.
So if you hear me say that, forgive me. But
it's okay.
So anyway, informal SMEs, SMMEs, MSMEs, whatever. There's a lot of acronyms floating around.
Yeah.
Trying to include the very small along with the not that small or in the mid-size. There's a vast difference among the various pieces of that acronym, right?
Yeah.
But we're going to focus on sort of the micro or small. Micro seems, I'm not a huge fan of that word, but very small businesses in the informal sector. What their needs are, how they can be best served with technology, which is kind of the core focus of this podcast and of BigFive Digital and our events. And kind of want to get into that a little bit. So why don't we start with kind of a lay of the land or a state of play in the informal sector? What are their biggest challenges? I mean, how big is it? I mean, I'm not looking to you to be a source of statistics necessarily, but give us a sense of the scale of it and kind of walk us through what are some of the biggest challenges that this very large sector is facing, and then we'll get into how do we make that better.
Sure. Just one part of my career, which I think is very relevant to what's the source of all the information that I have. I'm currently co-managing director of an institution called Amanda, which actually builds infrastructure, economically charged infrastructure in townships. So we currently have a presence in 16 different townships in South Africa, which has really been where I've got a lot of my on the ground, direct information and interactions with these SMMEs, SMEs, SMBs, and these micro businesses.
Whatever acronym you
You
prefer.
whatever you prefer, whoever's listening to this.
Yeah.
But I think being able to be exposed to such an array of different segments in so many different townships has definitely been where I've gathered the most information. So I don't deem myself to be an expert in the space, but definitely from the sample size that I've been able to have access to, it's been quite interesting what
You've
I've
learned a
seen.
lot from
So
spending time with these businesses, and that's what we're
yeah.
asking you.
Yeah. So, I mean, to answer your question, Charles, sorry, I just took a little turn there to create that context. To answer your question, I remember I was at Africa Tech Fest a few months ago, and I was at a tech fest, and I should be talking digital, but I was actually talking the total opposite, because I really think that's still so relevant when you're talking small businesses. I think that the problems that plague the small business space are very similar to what's happening in the traditional economy versus the digital economy. What I've seen is that people still need to solve that problem of market entry, of being able to participate in their businesses, to understand what they're doing before we want to digitize them or while we are digitizing them.
Well, you can
Those
throw
problems don't
digital
go
at
away.
somebody without understanding what their
Yeah,
problems are, because you have to have a specific problem you're solving with a specific solution,
of
right?
course. Yeah, yeah,
Oh, I think, yeah. I look at this all over the world, and it's like, okay, here's an app. Use it for what? What problem am I solving? How's this going to make
100%,
my life
100%.
better? And
Yeah,
if
yeah,
you can't come in with a full understanding, it's like the whole idea of startups should fall in love with the problem, not wouldn't fall in love with their technology. You need to understand
yeah,
the
yeah,
problem, right? So that's where we're starting this
100%.
conversation.
Yeah. And especially within the context of where we're trying to solve a problem,
Right.
right? It's just so much more important to really get down to what is actually happening on the ground in order to be able to formulate that. So I'm 100% on the same page that the problem that you are solving needs to be understood before you can formulate a solution or deploy that solution. And I think a part of solving the problem is how you go about deploying that solution, which is exactly what I was just going to speak to you about. And I think in general, startups are failing, right? And we're seeing that stats right now, that startups are failing, whether you're formal, informal, a township, or in the urban areas. So you can only imagine how much worse that looks like when it's going into a township economy, and when you are isolating and looking at what's just available in that sector, and then looking at what's happening to the startups. And the lay of the land as it looks right now is that there's a lot of interventions. There's a lot of things happening. There's a lot of money being moved. There's a lot of enterprise development money coming out of corporate sector, which is obviously driven by what we hear our BEE scorecard, which encourages that spend. There's a lot of money being thrown through CSI, which is your responsibility, community responsibility, and there's a lot of different solutions that exist. And I think a lot of the problem with what's happening, Charles, is that the people who we are building these for don't know what they don't know. And I know that sounds kind of like and intangible, but quite honestly, I think being very targeted with what we are putting into the informal economies or into the hands of these small businesses is so important, so people actually understand what is happening. So you've got all these interventions, and they're like all over the place, so to speak. And there's so much money being thrown at it. And here's an interesting perspective, right? Because all of this money is being invested in all these very many incubation programs, in all of these different solutions, there's a perception that the problem is being tackled, it's being handled. So
Money's being
the
spent, so it
government
must be
sees it
being
as we're
solved,
doing
right?
enough.
Yeah.
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 Sorry, Charles.
No, if money's being spent, then it must be being solved, right?
100%. Yeah. And who's actually measuring that impact? I mean, I don't even have that information,
Right.
and trying to really look at what is the true impact of all of these things that's taking place. And I think it's multi-layered, right? Because at one level, there's obviously the issue of access and the issue of actual connectivity and actually being able to have access to infrastructure. And I must say, there's so many amazing players actually doing such great work, and we're seeing it every day, that's bridging those communities for us where we find ourselves in these townships at the moment. And it's really great, but connecting someone and giving someone a device and then hoping to deploy something on that device is just part of it, and you really need to find a way to, how do you bring all of these things together almost into like a one-stop shop, so that you are doing the problem solving and not leaving people to kind of solve that all by themselves without any guidance.
If we could get into some specifics,
Yeah.
one of the things I always, again, I look at sort of how technology is deployed to small business all over the world. It's very different everywhere, of course. But,
Yeah.
again, there are some common problems. One is, aversion to technology or reluctance to adapt technology. That can be overcome, I think. The other issue is, what are the constraints that are specific to that market? It could be data. It could be, it could be device penetration. It could be any number of things. Cost is always one. What do you think
Yeah.
are some of the big? And again, the objective is not adoption of technology, right? The objective is
Yeah.
solving problems, right? But
Yeah.
the premise of kind of everything we do is that technology is part of the solution. And assuming you agree to at least at some level with that
Yeah.
statement,
I
yeah.
do. I
So
do.
what
Yes.
is the let's start with, what do you think are the major constraints, and then how do we overcome them?
Yeah. So the problem is large, and the response has to be a scaled response, which is why technology makes the most
Right.
sense, right? Because that's the only way we're going to be able to keep up with the size of the
Yeah.
problem. And yes, of course, access to data, cost of data, access to devices, security of consistent network. I mean, we don't have electricity in this country most of the
That is
time. So
that
let's
could be a
just
bit of
look
a
at that.
problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of,
Yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, I just want to say there's so many things happening right now. So, in all the townships that we play, I think like 80% of the spaces, I think it's just the 2 rural spaces that we're in that doesn't have fiber. So, when it comes to that, I think there's been some excellent work done infrastructurally on being able to actually connect people. And I really think that was a problem that we were facing a few years ago, which we are seeing is slowly minimizing, where there is connectivity into the townships, the models that are coming with it, and definitely all of the models where we are trying to make devices accessible and making it something that people can actually get their hands
Mm-hmm.
on is, I feel like that is now something that has become a smaller problem. But I really think that it's one thing giving people access, it's one thing giving them devices. But I spoke earlier, it's about how we actually deploy whatever the solution is. Because you could almost say, here you have the access, here is a solution, but it's about meeting people where you find them. And I want to stress that, because there is a huge difference between equality and
Yeah.
equity. And I think that reigns very well in the space as well. It's one thing wanting to see everybody end off at that same point, but it's another thing to meet people where you find them. So I think that's the key. Now that we've put the connectivity in place, the infrastructure is working, people are very much online. A lot of people there's a lot more people online versus where they were in the past. But what are people doing online, and do they understand the value of how everything could work together to actually elevate them in their situation? And I say that, but is there any existing platform that's bringing all those pieces together? And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
important. And coming back to the fact that there's a lot of information. We live in the information age. There's all this information coming in, whether in the form of incubation or whether in the form in South Africa. There's a lot of different government schemes for small businesses. I'll speak specifically to the fact that I myself am considered a Black woman in South Africa. When I started Refresh, I started that business having an honors degree, living in Sandton, having access to things, having a massive LinkedIn network and a mentorship network that I had through the work that I did. But I'll tell you, Charles, I did not know how to access any one of these funds for Black women in South
So it was
Africa.
for you, and you didn't
And
know how
I
to
didn't
get
know
it.
where to start.
Yeah.
100%. So these things don't 100% exist, but how do you connect all of these things to the people that need it? And how are we using the power of technology to actually scale that solution and make that
Mm-hmm.
accessible?
Wow,
So
these are big
that still remains
challenges.
the
Yeah,
big problem for
these are
me.
some
Yeah,
big challenges.
yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
in the time we have left, I think maybe it'd be a good idea to talk about what you've got a new startup. I don't know exactly when you formed it, but you can tell us. Called SwapVend Afrika. I'd like to hear a little bit about what that is, but kind of try to talk about it in how you applied all that you just said about the challenges and the right way to approach solving these problems,
Yeah.
how you applied all that thinking to trying to create a new business that addresses the informal market.
Yeah. So before I answer that, sorry, every time you ask me a question, I want to give you some context.
That's fine. That's fine.
Thank you. So, I mean, in South Africa, we obviously battled with apartheid back in the 1950s, and this is very
Yeah.
important because when the informal sector, so to speak, and the township economy was established, it was through that segregation of people, and that was purely done just based on
Right.
race, right? It wasn't based on any sort of economic stature. And one of the main things that underpinned that was making sure that townships were economically constricted. So the plan was to make sure there was constriction, so that if you needed to throttle the space, you could. Okay, and what's important is that so much of time has passed since 1994, since apartheid has gone, and so much of different money has been put into this. So many different interventions have come into play. But what remains still a problem is that this economic constriction has caused people to almost, that there's massive income disparities, and this lies at the base of it. So when solving for this problem, solving for it in pockets is not going to work. Oh, that's my opinion, at least. I think it needs to be solved holistically. The same amount of effort that was put into economically constricting needs to be the same amount of effort you put into almost to solve for that and using that the technology. Currently, Charles, in order for people to be able to access the disposable income that sits in the formal sector, people have to jump inside a taxi, leave townships and travel, and taxi fares are very high, and generally you take more than one taxi in order to get to a traffic light in an urban area where there's these little budding marketplaces that have popped up. We have very high crime rates. It's very hard to even engage with the vendor who's standing at your window. I mean, coming to shoot this podcast today, I passed about 5 or 6 traffic lights, and every one of them had a different type of vendor or different type of artist at these different intersections. You got to ask yourself, when these people come out, are they going to make enough even to jump back in the taxi and afford the taxi ride to get back home, leave alone make a profit out of this? So I think that's the first thing that I wanted to just paint that picture, and that creating that channel or creating that connection point between value and between skills and people, and being able to compete for disposable income that sits outside of the township economy shouldn't cost that much. And there should be some sort of guarantee that you're going to make something. So I come back to what is SwapVend and what are we trying to do? And I'm sure that taxi threw you off because my logo is this big yellow, what is known as a highest, Toyota highest. Yeah. So basically, SwapVend is a ecosystem platform made up of multiple things that connects the informal and formal sectors to one another, the intention to leverage cross-sector value. And what we've done is we wanted to create both a qualitative and quantitative experience where you're actually learning through the process, and you're not just getting solutions thrown at you, but you're understanding what is happening through that process. We developed this on the concept of this taxi, a digital taxi, and that's what we're building. Because right now, the only thing that connects those sectors are actually a physical taxi. Taxis are the only thing that moves people towards between one another.
So is this a metaphor?
Yes.
I mean,
well, it started off as, when we started to look at what we were building, we realized we're actually building a taxi because it's the only thing, like I said. And I think it started off as saying, I think this is what it looks like from a digital perspective. But it actually, the more time we spent with it and the more we scoped out what we were doing, actually, no, it's going to actually manifest into actual physical taxis, which actually gives you the power of digitization.
Well, what is the consumer? So, what is the user experience? What is the basic use case? I just want to be very clear about that.
Sure. So the platform is based on built with 3 different verticals. The first one is a very targeted journey. And so we're using the power of AI to really build a very, very tailored and specific mentorship journey that basically overarches everything that happens. Everything's very, very directed, very developed on an individual's needs. And coming back to the equality versus equity thing, to really understand where you're meeting a user where they are. The second vertical is speaking to business information and speaking to learning. So there's a learning platform. Information, untargeted information is just noise. And making sure that we are putting information into people's hands that they can actually utilize is very important. And the third vertical speaks to our marketplace. So you go into a low to no barrier to entry marketplace where everyone can actually participate and get an economic value.
Is the third one where the monetization takes place?
Yeah, pretty much. And I mean, ultimately, it's also just, if you think about the network value of crowding in the informal sector, where the informal sector is currently not really active in any other specific marketplace, to this extent that we are obviously hoping to have. This is basically the value of it. So when you're in this marketplace, you can trade. You can trade normally, or you can, and this is ultimately what we tried to do, was to create a marketplace where you can barter. So we try to create a formal space where we can eliminate the need for traditional cash or other payment, but to basically also give you the option to barter through this
And how does the
platform
barter
as you come into it.
I'm curious about how
So I'll give you a use case on
these
that.
transactions happen, if they're barter transactions.
Yeah. So right now, as we start with the first version that we go to market with, we won't have a payment gateway. So we'll basically allow the networking and the access to markets to take place. So you conclude your trades off the
Okay.
platform, but it's creating that connection point. So let's talk about one specific simple use case. And you have someone who's sitting in a township, and she has a business where she bakes cakes and she builds. Sorry, I'm giving a very basic scenario. Bakes cakes and pies. And she wants to actually be able to enter new markets, and she wants to grow her business, and she needs a website or she needs some sort of online presence. SwapVend will basically help you in the marketplace to connect you to someone at the first level, for someone who is actually looking to actually cater a child's party somewhere off in the side of Santon and looking for access to baked goods. And that person actually is primarily, their skill set is building websites, so some sort of online digital marketer. And that's basically the connection that the trade will take place at.
Okay.
So at a very simple level, that's basically what SwapVend will do. But what's important, Charles, is that this is not an isolated thing. For the informal trader, this is part of a very, very design journey for them to actually have a sustainable business.
Are you seeing corporate partnerships as part of this? I mean, talk about the partnership strategy a little bit.
Yeah, so definitely so, because we do need what's sitting in the corporate sector to basically link up and to really try and stimulate this informal side of things. So number one, it will definitely look at how do we drive. I told you earlier on, there's ED spend, there's all this money that comes to really wanting to invest in the space, definitely. But from a commercial value for these corporates, there's definitely access to these markets that they currently don't have access to. And one of the things that is very important to SwapVend is the way we're going to deploy. It's almost inherent to the model that we're going to deploy in person. There's going to be a lot of in-person interactions. This technology is going to be.
Which is how do you spread the news or the message to the informal businesses themselves? And this is a lot of. Is it events? Is it just what? Talk about that a little bit.
So at the moment, we've secured quite a substantial investment from the company that I work for, the Safe Hubs, where they give me access to 50,000 of their captured audience. Okay. So I already have secured 50,000 people that we would be able to go live with as soon as the platform is ready. So that was something we've been negotiating. And Charles, it was very intentional. I came to these guys. That's how I ended up getting a job with them. But I actually came to them to discuss this implementation partner network and relationship. And I think it was very important for us to first identify how we were going to go to market before we started to spend money, time, and investment to build something. And I think the time we spent refining that, and I mean, I started building this in 2019 on paper, and we're ready to go to market within the next few months. But it has definitely been a very intentional strategy to try and secure that route to market.
Great. So talk about what happens over the next few months with the business and to wrap up.
Yeah. So we at the point where we're building an MVP, hoping to go to market with very basic functionalities, but hopefully to already start onboarding. I think our aim is to really bring the informal sector online and already start creating those preliminary marketplace connections and start learning, teaching, and incubating people. And over the next 6 months to actually bring the full solution to market.
Great.
Yeah.
Outstanding. Well, we wish you the best with it. And just as a quick final note, you and Miranda Perumal will be speaking at our conference in March, kind of talking about some of the things we've just been talking about.
I'm very excited about that and really talking about economic inclusion. Yeah.
We're looking forward to having you, and we really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks so much, Charles. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining the Big5D Podcast Summit Speaker Series, featuring conversations about issues important to SMEs in Africa with the thought leaders slated to appear at the 2024 BigFive Summit in Cape Town. This episode was brought to you by the BigFive Summit, Africa's leading small business technology event, which takes place 19-20 March in Cape Town. To get involved with this event, please write to us at info@big5digital.org. This podcast is a production of Big5 Digital and is hosted and produced by me, Charles Laughlin, Editor-in-Chief of Big5 Digital. Thanks again for joining us, and stay tuned for more great episodes.